Hello, I'm Sarah. Now you may be wondering, why am I listening to this girl talk about philosophy? So I'd like to start by saying that I graduated from the University of Toronto. I majored in English literature and minored in philosophy and French studies. Today, I want to talk about the relationship between Voltaire and Leibniz. While I was in school, I remember studying Candide. In fact, I remember a few sleepless nights trying to finish this 40-page report on that book. But I didn't spend that much time on the Enlightenment age with philosophy. So now that I've been looking a little deeper into Leibniz specifically, I've become very interested in the relationship between him and Voltaire, specifically because Voltaire is making fun of him in his book, Candide, and I have so much experience with that book. But actually, I do love the book. I find it very fascinating, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by this kind of troll-like quality that it has towards Leibniz. So let's talk about those two. Voltaire was like a justice warrior. He would expose the evils of the world and criticize the societies that upheld those evils. Leibniz was a peacekeeper. His goal was the improvement of the human condition, and he wanted to achieve this through harmony. Specifically, he sought to reconcile rifts between different disciplines like religion, philosophy, science. These two different approaches to a very similar goal is what I argue leads Voltaire to ridicule Leibniz. So let's begin with Voltaire. Voltaire was a genius, a truly exceptional writer. He wrote during the 18th century, which was considered the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, or, due to the extreme influence of his writings, the age of Voltaire. Voltaire himself yearned for the intellectual renaissance of previous decades, specifically when the Republic of Letters was holding great influence and sway in Europe. The Republic of Letters was a whole group of prominent thinkers of different disciplines, like science, arts, philosophy, religion, and they received mutual assistance from each other and shared their thoughts. One quote I found in describing this Republic of Letters talked of it as a comfort against religious and political disagreements that tore Europe apart at the time. Now, Voltaire believed that this period specifically held great progress, and that is what he wanted to see again. In his writings, Voltaire specifically criticized religious intolerance. Now, he wasn't an atheist as we would understand it today. He believed that people having a minor belief in a deity or a god did help with social cohesion, and that it could definitely be beneficial. Now, for himself, the type of god that he believed in was one that created the world and then just stepped back, had nothing more to do with it. And this has a few names. It's called rational religion, or natural religion, or deism. Now, to be fair, I think in the 18th century that might be about as close to atheist as you can get, but whatever. So he loathed fanaticism and idolatry and superstition, and generally all organized religion. And he made a really big impact on society with his texts about religious tolerance. He championed the values of free speech. He rejected bigotry, superstition, and the hand that they played in oppression. Voltaire is famous for his championing of free speech. In fact, there's quotes, I disagree with what you're saying, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it, or something like that. A quote that's constantly attributed to him. But he didn't actually say it. That's not the important part, though. It's that he represents that freedom of speech so intensely that these quotes just get associated with him. And if you have read the title of the video, you know that I'm calling him a troll. So I'd like to point out that it's specifically in the book Candide that I think Voltaire is trolling. I'm not talking about his other great texts and his works that are championing free speech and religious tolerance. Just Candide. Now, Voltaire was a satirical writer, which you could say is kind of like the classic OG form of trolling. So I don't think I'm that far off in calling him a troll. I'm just, no disrespect, Voltaire. Just trying to speak truths here. So in the 18th century, they did not take too kindly to the trolling or satirical writing. Voltaire had published works previously that got him thrown in the Bastille, or prison, for like a year. So when he published Candide, which is pretty dirty, and it doesn't specifically criticize the government or monarchy, but it does criticize the kind of general religious ideas of the time in a kind of grotesque way. Funny, but like fart joke kind of humor funny way. So he published it anonymously, but it did end up becoming not only his most widely read book, but the most widely read book of the entire 18th century. So the title, which I've just been saying is Candide, is actually Candide or Optimism. So he's not really giving us a choice here. It's not like it's titled either Candide or Optimism. What he's saying is that Candide and optimism are one and the same, that you can use either name because they mean the same thing. And when he says optimism, he doesn't mean like thinking happy thoughts, being optimistic. It's capital O optimism, the philosophical theory of optimism, which was made by Leibniz. So before we talk more about Candide, the book, we need to talk about Leibniz and his philosophy of optimism. So Leibniz was more than just a philosopher, first of all. He was considered to be the most universally learned man in all of Europe. So he was born about 50 years before Voltaire. And it was these decades past the time of Leibniz that Voltaire was yearning for. In fact, it was Leibniz who got the whole Republic of Letters going. He's the one who sustained it. So Leibniz was a man who discoursed with all sorts of different thinkers, philosophers, religious thinkers, scientists, but also people from different cultures and different faiths. Beyond that, he was also basically a scientist. He studied at a scientific institution. He published physics papers. He even co-authored calculus. So this guy was so much more than just philosophy, and so much more than just his religious philosophy, the philosophy of optimism. Leibniz's ultimate aim was the improvement of the human condition. Whether it was religion or philosophy, this was the goal to strive towards. He encouraged and promoted science education all across Europe. He championed the idea that science and theology could work together, that science could find the truth, and that the truth was worth finding. He wasn't bringing religion into science. He was bringing science into religion. He brought practicality and rationalism to his theology. He wasn't out there trying to tell people how to live their lives, to never help others, as Voltaire would suggest through Candide. He wanted to bring logic into the thinking behind religion in order to help improve society. And one of the big issues in society during his time was called the problem of evil. And it goes like this. If God is good, why is there evil in the world? After a devastating earthquake in Portugal, the entire European society was in crisis. How could they reconcile the contradiction of a God that was good and the horrors and evils that came from natural disasters? This became the problem of evil. It gripped Europe in an existential crisis. So Leibniz tried to solve the problem. His answer became philosophy of optimism. Basically, he said, God is good. He is perfect as we understand him. The evil that we see and experience is actually part of a greater pattern of good. So Leibniz said that despite the evils that we see, we actually do live in the best of all possible worlds. And this was widely accepted. But 50 years later or so, Voltaire was not having it. So Voltaire does not claim to have a solution to the problem of evil, but he is hell-bent on making sure that answers he thinks are incorrect are discredited. He was not a fan of Leibniz's theory of optimism. He viewed it as just a kind of religious gaslighting, because it basically said, no, the evil that you see isn't there, it's all actually good. And if you just look at the surface of the philosophy and you kind of ignore its context, both the philosopher and the time period, then yeah, I can see how it can look like that. But I would like to offer a different interpretation. So if you watched my first video, you saw me rework Leibniz's theory of optimism to remove God. But this theory's actually been really growing on me. Like, how do you explain the greater good of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? And I'd like to point out that when Leibniz is talking about these evils that are actually part of a pattern of greater good, he was reacting to the horrors of natural disasters, not human evils. How do you explain the greater good of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? Well, study geology, planetary biology, and you'll see that if you don't have those things, then you don't have any life to kill. We need plate tectonics, we need the earthquakes, we need the volcanic eruptions in order to create the habitable world that we have today. So yeah, Leibniz was kind of right that science was going to bring us the answer to see how there was this greater pattern of good, a way to explain the reasons for the horrors that were rocking their society. But also, it reminds me of a multiverse theory from metaphysics. And this is why I'm really loving Leibniz's theory. So there's this, metaphysics theory that tries to answer the, big question of why does life exist, especially given the fact that we have no evidence of life anywhere else. With just one data point, we really don't have much to go on. And so this theory basically says that the reason life exists in our universe is because the universe we live in has the perfect physics and the perfect chemistry, the perfect science, in order to allow life to exist. So of all the different universes, this is the best of all possible universes because it's the one in which life can arise. So take that, down with that planetary geology and how these horrors, they lead to, the best possible planet for life to live on. It really is just such an interesting theory. It works on so many levels. And I really have a bone to pick with Voltaire and the way he's just smacking this theory around in his book, because I actually like Candide. I think it's a great book. It's a fun adventure story. And so I really want to get to the heart of why Voltaire is trolling so hard in that book. So first of all, just speaking to Voltaire, I want to say it's called optimism, not ignorance. These two words are not interchangeable, and reading Candide, you'd think they were. Moving on. I'd like to argue that Voltaire and Leibniz were actually working towards the same goals, and that Voltaire is actually being intolerant of Leibniz's religious approach. And this shockingly intolerant behavior from Voltaire is what leads him to make this nasty presentation of Leibniz's theory in his book. I'd also like to say, when talking about what types of evil, in Candide, Voltaire mostly presents human types of evil, evil acts done by others, whereas Leibniz was really, responding to natural disasters. So already the setting is a little bit off to give a proper presentation of this philosophical theory. Moving on to the characters. In the novel, the character Dr. Pangloss basically represents Leibniz, and he actively encourages the young Candide to do nothing to improve the state of the world around him. He even stops him from trying to save someone when they're drowning. He tries to stop Candide from helping others. He tells him, just be happy, ignore everything around you, don't look at anything bad. But this is just so not what the philosophy of optimism is about. It is not about impotence and doing nothing. If you actually look at Leibniz, his actions, who he was, if you look at the context of where this philosophy came from, a person who believed in the theory of optimism, Leibniz, is nothing like Dr. Pangloss or Candide. He was not someone who sat around in a stuffy chair saying, oh, just be happy, do nothing. He was quite the opposite. He wanted to solve problems. His life works went towards improving the world that he knew. He is most famous for believing the goal of philosophy, of religion, is the improvement of the human condition. So how does that fit with someone who's saying, do nothing? It doesn't make sense. It is just a misrepresentation. Leibniz didn't set out to solve the problem of evil by gaslighting everyone into doing nothing about the problems of the world. He was trying to bring order in a time of chaos and crisis. Voltaire can sit comfortably more than a generation later and say that Leibniz's solution is no good. But Leibniz was living through that crisis. He made that theory before anyone had any other solutions. So good job, Voltaire, for trolling his solution, but you didn't bring anything else to the table. You just did it from the, this comfortable space where you no longer were worried about it. I'd like to argue that when you look at Leibniz's two main philosophies and include his actions, so you have, we live in the best of all possible worlds, plus philosophy and religion exist for the improvement of the human condition. Leibniz saying, with his theory of optimism, stop whining about the world not being the perfect, beautiful place you want it to be. Don't lose yourself in an existential crisis because of a contradiction in your faith. Instead, accept that there are evils in the world and we cannot understand them, and get on with the real work of religion and philosophy, making the world a better place. Voltaire wrote extensively on religious intolerance, rejecting it. And although Leibniz never really talked on that topic specifically, his goals were finding harmony, not only between faith and reason, but also between peoples and cultures. He might not have spoken out against religious intolerance, but he did write papers supporting the Catholic Church, even though he's not a Catholic. He communicated with Jewish rabbis. His actions prove that he supported religious tolerance, and he wanted to learn from other cultures and other religions, just like Voltaire. It might be fair for Voltaire to accuse Leibniz of trying to brush aside the problem of evil, but he's not doing that in order to urge people into blindly following religious doctrine. And he definitely doesn't argue against progress or innovation or change, improvement. He's brushing aside the problem of evil because it doesn't warrant deeper discussion or thinking. It was a crisis which needed an answer, a point of conflict that needed to be harmonized so that the world could get on with the science and mathematical discoveries. In fact, I would say that ultimately, Leibniz's theory of optimism tells us to do much the same as the end of Voltaire's book. When Candide chooses to put aside the adventuring and philosophizing in order to go cultivate our garden, he's accepting there's nothing to be achieved by wandering and pondering over the existence of horror and evil. Our best choice is to opt out of cruelty and to work on improving ourselves, our society, our garden. When Leibniz answers the question, why does evil exist if God is good? With the answer, because God did the best he could with what he was given. He's telling us to accept what we are given. Yes, there's evil in the world, but step forward and do the best you possibly can. So why does Voltaire go to such great lengths to troll Leibniz? He seems to be accusing Leibniz of just blindly leading people into religious doctrine, which of course is what he hates the most. But I'd further like to argue that based on psychological theories, which say that we are most repulsed by people that we consider to be bad, but who we also feel a similarity to. And so, in this way, Voltaire is specifically repulsed by Leibniz because he takes what is very much on the surface a religious doctrine, which Voltaire hates. And yet they're similar. They're connected in their passions, their goals, by the Republic of Letters and the importance it held for both of them. This connection, faced with the stark difference in the approach to their goals, specifically that Leibniz makes use of religious doctrine and upholds religious doctrine, this increases the level of repulsion that Voltaire felt towards Leibniz and his theory of optimism specifically. And this then is the driving force behind Voltaire's narrow, pointed, and nasty critique of the theory of optimism. And that is why Voltaire made fun of Leibniz. By the way, I don't have some deep passion for Voltaire or Leibniz, but I do have a passion for looking at things from a different perspective. When I see two widely acclaimed writers, thinkers, basically going at each other's throats, and there's, no solution in sight after hundreds of years, that interests me. That makes me want to find another perspective, another way of understanding this whole problem. I would love to see a discourse between Leibniz and Voltaire, like if Voltaire had been alive during the Republic of Letters, or if they were just born a little bit closer and Voltaire had published Candide while Leibniz was still around and he could, respond to it. That would be interesting. So if Voltaire and Leibniz did have a discussion, what do you think would happen? What would they say? How would Leibniz respond to this critique of his theory? I imagine he would be quite polite in his response, very philosopher-like. But, once Voltaire started going at him with his, quick wit and his good writing, I wonder, would we get, a bit of catfight? That is something that I really wish we could see. But as it is, we don't have a debate between them. Instead, Leibniz just got trolled. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. If you want to see more, subscribe. Bye-bye!